Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Hayward. I am the founder of Prophesy Legacy Ministries and the visionary of Cornerstone Fellowship. I'd like to welcome you to our talk through the text lesson. We're studying ordinary people, and tonight is lesson 2, Simon Peter, the leader. Thank you to everyone that's joined us for tonight, and just sit back, enjoy the lesson, and feel free if you have any questions to type them in the text as we go along, the chat box as we go along. Our objectives for this evening, the student will be able to identify the 4 locations in scriptures that list the apostles. You'll be able to understand the names given to Peter and their significance. You'll be able to identify the leaders of the groups within the apostles and the information about them. You'll be able to explain the difference between fishermen and fishers of men. You'll be able to understand the differences in character between Simon and Simon Peter. You'll be able to identify the raw materials that make Peter a leader. And those will be our objectives for tonight's lesson. So, focusing on the scriptures, we're going to look at the 4 lists of the apostles in the scriptures. The first location is going to be Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4. Next, we have Mark chapter 3, verses 16 through 19. And then we have Luke chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. And finally, Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 13. Okay, so the 12 are arranged into 3 groups of 4. Group 1 always has Peter as the head of the list, and that group always includes Andrew, John, and James. So again, group 1, Peter is always listed first, and then we have Andrew, James, and John. Group 2 always features Philip first and includes Bartholomew, Matthew, and Thomas. The final group, group 3, is always led by James, son of Alphaeus, and it includes Simon the Zealot, Judas, son of James, called Thaddeus, which also in the book of Mark is referred to as Labius, whose surname is Thaddeus in Matthew, and of course, Judas Iscariot. The names at the head of the groups appear to be the group leaders, and the group always appears in that same order. Peter, James, and John are often seen together in the presence of Jesus. They were together on the Mount of Transfiguration and in the heart of the Garden of Gethsemane. Group 2 is not as high of a profile group as Group 1, but they are significant figures in the gospel accounts. Group 3, on the other hand, they're more distant and rarely mentioned in the narrative accounts of Jesus, except, of course, Judas Iscariot. Group 1 is the only group tied together by a common thread, which is the fact that they are all fishermen. They're 2 sets of brothers, and they come from the same community and have been friends for a very long time. Okay, so that's a little bit of the characteristics about the groups. And moving forward, the name Simon. Okay, Simon was a common name, so let's talk briefly about Simon, also known as Peter, depending upon the situation. Simon is a very common name. There are about 7 Simons in the Gospels. 2 are listed amongst the apostles, Simon Peter and Simon the Zealot. Jesus' half-brother's name was Simon. We confirm this in Matthew 13 in verse 55, which says, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas?" Now, Judas Iscariot's father was named Simon, according to John chapter 6 and verse 71. It says, "He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him." Jesus had dinner at the home of Simon the leper, according to Matthew 27 and 32. while Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper. The man that helped Jesus carry his cross part of the way to Calvary was known as Simon the Cyrene. It's stated in Matthew 27 and 32, as they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and he was, and they forced him to help carry the cross. Now, Simon the apostle was born Simon Bar Jonah, which means Simon, the son of Jonah, as stated in Matthew 16 and 17, which reads, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for that was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by the Father in heaven." Simon Peter's father's name was John, which was sometimes translated as Jonah. In John 21, verses 15 through 17, it says, "When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' 'Yes, Lord,' he said. 'You know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my lambs.' Again, Jesus said, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' He answered, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Take care of my sheep.' The third time he said to him, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, 'Do you love me?' He said, 'Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you.'" Jesus gave Simon another name. He called him Peter, which is found in Luke 6 and 14. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew. We have to pay close attention to the way Luke writes this. There's always something in the details. Jesus didn't replace his name. He also named him Peter, because at times he was Simon, and sometimes he was Peter, and other times he was Simon Peter. That's just like it is with our situations, our personal situations. My friends call me Nick. My coworkers call me Nick. My mother refers to me as Nicholas, but if I'm ever called Nicholas Nathaniel Hayward, there's a whole nother situation going on. So this was the same way with Peter. His name was Simon, but Jesus also gave him the name Peter. We'll learn a little more about that as we go along. By nature, Simon was brash and undependable. He made promises that he couldn't follow through with. He jumps in head first, full of vigor, but he often never completes a task. It appears Jesus changed his name because he wanted the nickname to remind Simon of who he should strive to be. Simon was his old self, and Peter was his calling. That's the beautiful thing about Jesus. And when Jesus is doing something in our lives, he sees all and he knows all. So he calls us by our given name, but Peter was special because he would call him by his given name of Peter, but sometimes he called him by his nickname. He called him by his given name of Simon, but sometimes he called him by his nickname of Peter because he didn't want to appeal to who Simon was, but he wanted to sort of elevate him into his calling. Peter, on the other hand, was just like most Christians. He was carnal at times, but spiritual at others. He fell short and gave into his flesh, but also functioned and operated in the spirit. He was like at a tennis match with himself, all by himself. Sometimes he was on the left as Simon, other times he was on the right as Peter, but he was the leader of the 12. So, Ordinary People, the series that we're studying here. So here's a man who is clearly conflicted, just like all of us. He's a normal man. He's hot-headed. He's jumping into situations and not seeing them through. He's always quick to go and not to see it through till the end. But for some reason, Jesus decides to make him the leader of the group and give him another name. It's like, I see who you are, but I'm going to call you by that which I expect you to be. But isn't it a beautiful account that we get to sit back and witness the transformation? Isn't it a beautiful account that we get to sit back and see Simon as well as Peter? We see the growth and we see the difference. It's amazing what can happen when we incorporate Christ into our lives. So we understand that Peter was a fisherman, but we also understand that they were called to be fishers of men. Simon Peter was a fisherman by trade. He and Andrew, his brother, were heirs to the family fishing business. Okay, so they had a little bit of clout. They had, a business. They weren't like starving. Commercial fishermen during this time all caught three types of fish in the area. The first type is sardines. They were small. They were a small fish for the area. This is the type of fish associated with the feeding of 5,000. Sardines and a kind of flat bread were the staple in that region of the Sea of Galilee. Another type of common fish were called barbels. Barbels are fish that had a fleshy filament in the corners of their mouth. They can grow up to 15 pounds. This was probably the type of fish that Peter caught with the coin in its mouth. This was the only type of fish in the Sea of Galilee that was large enough to swallow a coin. Matthew 17:27 tells us, but so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Okay, mud is the third type of common fish in the area. They grow anywhere from 6 to 18 inches. Fried mud is still served in restaurants near the Sea of Galilee, and it's known as St. Peter's fish. We know Simon Peter was the leader of the apostles, not because he was always listed first in the apostle list, but because Matthew 10:2 tells us, these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Okay, so it appears that we're always saying that Peter is listed first, but I want to bring special notice to the word first, because first, translated in Greek, is referred to as protos. Protos does not refer to order, but it refers to chief leadership. So he's listed first in order, but the term first there lets us know that he was the chief leader of the apostles. Peter's leadership is seen because he is always in the foreground, taking the lead, and he is naturally the dominant one in the group. Peter was formed, equipped, and renamed by God's sovereign design to be the leader. When we look at Peter, we see how God builds leaders. So notice it says that he was formed, he was equipped, and he was renamed by God's sovereign design. So that just lets us know. So yes, he chose ordinary people, but he worked with these ordinary people because they had an intimate relationship, and this intimate relationship prepared them and equipped them for that which he called them to do. Peter is mentioned a lot because Peter's name is mentioned in the gospel more times than anyone other than Jesus himself. Nobody speaks as often as Peter, and no one is spoken to by Jesus as often as Peter. No one is rebuked by the Lord as much as Peter as well. So with leadership and prominence comes some things that we have to deal with. So we understand that Peter spoke to Jesus a lot, but not only did Jesus speak to Peter, but he also rebuked Peter more than any of the other disciples. No one confessed Christ more boldly than Peter or acknowledged his lordship like Peter, yet no one verbally denied Christ more forcibly and publicly than Peter did. Peter's life gives us three elements of a true leader: the raw material, the experience, and the right character qualities. So let's keep in mind here, we understand that Peter had the intimate relationship and he talked to Jesus a lot and he was rebuked by Jesus a lot, but still, just as bold as Peter was and as brash as he was to jump in head first, as gung-ho as he was, and like, I'm in it to win it, I'm in it with you. He's the loud one, he's the boisterous one, but no one denied Jesus as verbally, forcefully, and publicly as Peter did. So now let us go a little further into the elements of a true leader: the raw materials, the experience, and the character qualities. Okay. The raw materials that make Peter a leader. Peter's story is a strong argument for the belief that leaders are born with certain gifts, but the gifts must be properly shaped into a true leader by a leader. Psalms 139, verses 13 through 16 state, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Okay, Psalms 139, verses 13 through 16. By virtue of the divinely designed process of pregnancy, God watches over the development of the child, even from the mother's womb. Certain features of Simon Peter's natural disposition were crucial to his leadership ability. These characteristics usually can't be developed, but they are a part of Peter's temperament. The first one, inquisitions. Leaders should ask lots of questions. A leader is never happy to remain ignorant about what they don't understand. So inquiring minds want to know. Leaders are always going to ask questions because they don't want to lead and not have an idea and truly understand what's going on. Leaders are insatiably curious. They understand knowledge as power, and whoever has the information leads. Leaders ask the right questions, and they are generally always looking for answers. Inquisitiveness is usually manifested in early childhood. We all know children that need to know the hows and the whys. The best problem solvers are people who are driven by an unquestionable enthusiasm for knowing and understanding things. We've all seen the children that everything you say, they say why. We all know the children that watch everything you do and mimic every action that you make. We all get annoyed by people that sometimes ask a lot of questions, but we understand now how inquisitiveness can be a raw quality for leadership. Peter usually asks God to explain his difficult sayings. In Matthew 15 and 15, Peter said, "Explain the parable to us." Peter asked how often he needed to forgive. Matthew 18 and 21 says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?'" Peter asked questions when he saw Christ and after the resurrection, John 21 and 20 through 22. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who's going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Characteristic number 2, initiative. A true leader has drive, ambition, and energy. He's the type of person that makes things happen. Not only did Peter ask questions, he was usually the first to answer them as well. Matthew 16, verses 13 through 16 state, "When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say the Son of Man is?' They replied, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' 'But what about you?' he asked. 'Who do you say I am?' Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah, Son of the living God.'" Keep in mind, these characteristics are only raw materials. Peter still needed to be shaped, matured, and trained. The third raw material, involvement. A true leader is always in the middle of the action. They don't sit in the background and tell others what to do. So a leader is involved. Leaders lead from the front. Leaders get in the trenches with you. We see that Peter was a fisherman, but we also see that he became fishers of men. So we learn that these are raw materials. So therefore, they're characteristics and materials that help make him who he was, but the raw materials wouldn't be any good if Jesus still didn't nurture him and teach him and help mature him. So we all know that while we're growing and everything that we go through always serves a purpose. So let's look at the life experiences that shape Peter. Peter had the kind of life experiences that formed him into the kind of leader Christ wanted him to be. True leaders are made, not just born. Hard experiences taught Peter a lot. He learned that crushing defeat and deep humiliation often followed hard on the heels of our greatest victories. Simon Peter said, You are the Messiah, Son of the living God, Matthew 16:16. Right after Christ commended Peter for his great confession, Peter suffered the hardest rebuke ever recorded of a disciple in the New Testament. One moment, Christ called him Peter, blessed, promising him the keys of the kingdom, verses 17-19. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." In the next paragraph, Christ addressed Peter as Satan. That's verse 23. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Imagine how that must feel. You were Peter sitting here. He's just commended. He's just built up. And then a few verses later, he gets the ultimate rebuke. But when you're going through the learning process, there are going to be good days, there are going to be bad days, there are going to be highs, and there are going to be lows. But all of these things come together to help formulate you into the leader that you become. And the beautiful thing about leadership is you never forget the tough lessons. You take the stripes or the bruises as they come along and the bumps and the bruises along the way. But when it's your turn to lead, you use those as like navigating blocks, and it sort of keeps you in your lane. And then when it's your turn to mentor, you remember the tough lessons, but you give the tough lessons in love. Let's look at the character qualities of leaders. Character is absolutely critical in leadership. So the current lack of morality in America is directly related to the fact that we have elected, appointed, and hired too many leaders that have no character. We look at situations where people are controlled by their emotions and they're making decisions purely based on what's going to benefit them and not what's going to benefit the people overall. People are given roles of leadership based upon their families. People are given roles of leadership based upon their contributions and financial gifts, but no one is really looking at character. And when you look at a situation where leadership is based on these things as opposed to character, you'll always find ultimate chaos. So character is what makes leadership possible. People simply cannot respect or trust those that lack character. If a man is not respected, he will not be followed. Lasting leadership is grounded in character. Character produces respect. Respect produces trust, and trust motivates followers. Okay. Now let's look at the character qualities of the spiritual leader within Peter. All of this comes together to help us develop and see Simon Peter, the leader. Okay. Character quality number 1, submission. True leaders don't demand submission. They are examples of submission by the way they submit to the Lord and those who are in authority over them. Peter had the authority to be dominant, aggressive, and very confident. He was quick to speak and act. The Lord taught Peter submission to balance that part of him out. So we know, again, he was the hothead. He jumped in. He was eager to get started, but he always didn't see things through to the end. You know, he's like, go, get it, let's get it done. So that's a great character, a great aspect of him. But to balance that out, because everything requires balance, God taught him submission. So you're gung-ho and ready to go, but I'm also going to make you submissive so that you can find the balance between the two. The second character quality is going to be restraint. True leaders with natural leadership abilities don't usually excel in exercising restraint. Self-control, discipline, and moderation don't always come natural to a person that leads. Jesus had to put a bit in Peter's mouth, figuratively speaking, to teach him restraint. That is why Peter was rebuked so many times. He means well. He's got good intentions. He sort of speaks without thinking, but Jesus had to teach him restraint, because while speaking well and being gung-ho and being the go-getter is great, some situations require restraint. So we see here how the character quality of restraint balances him out for how he's the go-getter and over the top. Character quality number 3, humility. Leaders are often tempted by the sin of pride. The besetting sin of leadership may be the tendency to think more of oneself than others. To think more of oneself than one ought to think. The Lord made Peter humble, and when Peter wrote his first epistle, he said, "In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. All of you, clothe yourselves in humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 6. Humility is important, and one of the greatest examples of humility that we saw was in the upper room when Christ washed the feet of the disciples. Okay, so again, there has to be balance. So just as much as he was the leader and he was gung-ho and going forward, he also had to have humility. And we know that Peter learned the lesson because when Peter wrote the epistle, he harped on that humility. That's a point that he stressed very often. Another character quality is going to be love. All the disciples struggled with learning that true spiritual leadership means loving service to one another. The real leader is someone who serves, not someone who demands to be waited upon. That's deep. Mark 9:35 tells us, sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." The Lord himself constantly modeled this kind of loving servant leadership to the disciples. The best display of this was in the upper room on the night of his betrayal. Let's examine that scene. Okay, so the Passover was held in a rented room in Jerusalem. The ceremony usually lasted 4 to 5 hours. Celebrants usually reclined in low chairs rather than sitting upright. Most participants traveled great distance to celebrate, so their feet were muddy and dusty. When you entered a home for a meal, there was usually a servant present to wash the feet of the guests. It was a major insult if the host didn't have someone to wash the feet of the guests. Usually the guest foot washer was the lowliest and least desired job. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair." Luke 7:44. So we're understanding that, the Passover season is among them. People travel great distances to get to the city. And you got to think about the time when these scriptures are written. So there weren't paved roads. There weren't like beautiful grassy knolls. There weren't pavers along the way. It was dust and dirt. So the longer you travel, the dustier your feet became. You might get to a point where it's just nothing but mud, and you got to walk through it. So you arrive at someone's house, your feet are covered in clay and mud, and they probably smell because you've been doing all this walking. So the owner of the home had the person there and present who was to wash your feet. And of course, this is a job that nobody wants to do. No one wants to touch the feet of strangers, even people that you know, especially they're caked and crusted in mud and dust. So that's not a job that people wanted. But we see in Luke 7:44, the lady was there. She wet his feet with her tears and she dried it with her hair. Ultimate example of humility. At the Passover, this custom was apparently overlooked with the rented room, and no one was present to wash feet. But as we know, that was all a part of the design. The disciples seemed prepared to overlook the custom rather than to volunteer to do the job themselves. Jesus himself, the Son of God, rose up and performed the task. So imagine they're here at the Passover, at the Last Supper. They've been with Jesus. They followed him for a few years now. They've seen all the customs. They knew what was to happen. They understood. They've been taught and shown examples of humility. They've been told that we need to love. The 12 are very familiar with one another, but yet in the room full of familiar people, everyone decided to pretend that they forgot the custom and overlooked the custom. So in the midst of the feet washing ceremony, the disciples were concerned and agreeing about which of them was the greatest. That's found in Luke 22:24. A dispute also arose among them to which of them would be considered the greatest. They wanted to be elevated, and they were so concerned with that they missed the ultimate expression of humility and genuine love. So everybody's so concerned with who gets the number one spot, and we're so concerned with battling amongst ourselves to say it should be me and not you, it should be me and not you. And they were doing this, and while they were doing this, they were missing the ultimate display of humility, because the King of Kings was here on his knees, girded and washing feet. Okay. When it was Peter's turn to get his feet washed, Peter did a Peter, as we're going to say, and he asked Jesus if he was going to wash his feet. Peter did not want Jesus to wash his feet, found in John 13:8. And Jesus' response was, no. I'm sorry. And this was the response. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. There's a lot of symbolism in the story of feet washing, but the central lesson was all about the way love should be shown. Jesus' example was a consummate act of lowly, loving service. So Peter, again, who always has an answer and always has a response, Peter didn't get down and wash everybody's feet, but Peter was looking around the room and Peter saw what was happening. And when it was Peter's turn, he said, no, you're not going to wash my feet. Like you're Jesus and I'm Peter, and that's not what we're going to do. But Jesus told him quickly, if I don't wash you, you have no part of me. Okay. Peter learned to love, and love became one of the hallmarks of his teachings. 1 Peter 4:8 states, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. So beautiful examples here, because we get to see Simon and we get to see his growth into Peter, and we even see the stumblings along the way. But in his epistle, we see that he finally learned the lesson and he's sharing the teachings with others. Peter was urging us to love to the maximum capacity. He wasn't referring to a natural feeling or how we respond to lovable people. He was referring to a love that covers and compensates for all other weaknesses. Another trait, courage. Peter had a false sense of courage that caused him, as a fisherman, to think that he was a swordsman and that he could behead Malchus. He needed to learn a mature self-willingness to suffer for Christ's sake. The kingdom of darkness was set up against the kingdom of light. Lies are set up against the truth, Satan against God, and demons against the holy purpose of Christ. With this being said, Peter would face difficulty where he went. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. John 21:18. The price of preaching would be the death for Peter. Persecution, oppression, trouble, torture, and martyrdom. Peter needed to have a rock solid courage so that he could persevere. Pentecost is when we see the shift in Peter. Acts 4 tells us how Peter and John were brought before the Sanhedrin and instructed not to speak or teach in the name of Jesus. Acts 4:18. Then they called them in again and commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. Peter and John's reply is recorded in verses 19 through 20. But Peter and John replied, which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. Peter learned his lessons and his character was transformed and he became the man that Christ called him to be. It's all a process. And we got to see this process from the beginning. This is a great example for us because we learned that it's a process. You're not going to get it right from the beginning. You have to be taught along the way. You have to be open to the rebukes. But when you get the lesson, you should share the lesson with those that are coming after you. You can be bold. You can be, straight to the point. You can always be ready to jump, but you got to have love and humility and other things to balance that out. So we see here what I like to call the balanced scorecard. You got your raw materials, you got the characteristics to make you a leader, but then you got the love and the teaching of Jesus along with the Holy Spirit to bring it all together. We know that Jesus told Peter he would die as a martyr. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." John 21:18-19. Eusebius cites the testimony of Clement, who says that before Peter was crucified, he was forced to watch the crucifixion of his wife. As it happened, he shouted, "Remember the Lord." When it was his time to die, he requested to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to die as the Lord did. So this is our lesson about Simon Peter, the leader. So lesson 2, ordinary people, we got to take a closer look at Simon Peter. We got the opportunity to see some of the characteristics of Simon. We got to understand his natural job as a fisherman. We got to understand his transformation to a fisher of men. We also got to understand the characteristics that were present in his life, but we also saw the qualities that he was endowed with, and we saw how when the two came together, it made him who he needs to be. We got a chance to witness how Peter had a closeness with Jesus. He spent a lot of time with him. He asked him a lot of questions. He was the leader of the 12, but he was also the most rebuked of the 12. But it's all a part of the process. So whatever you're going through in your life, we have to realize that to get to your purpose, there is a process. A lot of times we want to bypass the process and just have the purpose, but you can't have one without the other. So this was our lesson 2, ordinary people. And I hope that there was something shared in this lesson tonight to help you see how an ordinary person like Simon became the extraordinary person of Peter. I hope that you are able to see how the name that you were born with has nothing to do with the qualities that Jesus will equip you for in the life that comes after. So this concludes our lesson. Are there any questions that anyone has at this time? I thank you all for tuning in. And now I've done a lot of talking. So this is a part of the service where you all can take a part as well. We'd like to give you the opportunity to worship through giving. The ministry is going forward. We're thankful for all the donations and gifts that have come in thus far. But as you can see on your screen, our Cash App is $PLM Cornerstone. Or if you don't have Cash App and you'd like to mail in a monetary donation, you can mail it to Prophesied Legacy Ministries, found at 107 Eagle Ridge Road, Summerville, South Carolina, 29485. I hope that everyone enjoyed the lesson tonight. I hope that you all will join us on Monday night for our PLM prayer time, and I'll see you next Tuesday night right here in this spot as we continue our talk through the text, Ordinary People. God bless you and have a good night.